If you are a speaker, you know that the most powerful part of any speech is the story within it, or the stories within it, which move the audience emotionally. The question I have is this: have you lived the stories you tell? Have you lived the stories you tell? In other words, is your background applicable to the stories you tell your audience? We know that the most powerful story any of us can ever tell is generally the one we've been reluctant to tell, the one that makes us feel vulnerable, exposed, tender. If we are willing to present this sort of story, it can become the keynote speaker speech story, which can take us on the professional speaking circuit, if that is what we want. People tour the world on a motivational speech based on their background of overcoming some really bad difficulty and triumphing. But I'm not talking about that here. I'm talking about stories that come from your background. For example, if you happen to be a dentist, and you've been a dentist all your life, and you're trying to tell stories about how to do concreting, and you've never done concreting in building a home, you're not going to come across as very creditable. The point I'm making is, have you lived the background? Quite recently, I told a story which I have told, I don't know how many times before, maybe 200 times. It's a long story. It involves the sea. It involves sailing ships. It involves the Antarctic. It involves things like seals and penguins. And I can tell that story because of my background. So I can tell because I've lived the contents of the stories I tell. I can still tell stories quite authentically about the world of aviation, or police stories from the point of view of patrol cars, or stories of the sea, because I was a sailor at one stage. Point I'm making is this: if you are a person who likes to tell stories, you want to give them some sort of authentication, you need to be able to speak the language, use the terminology, the phraseology from that particular world, and do it without thinking about it. The words, the phrases just trip from your tongue because this was your background at some stage in your life. I'm very fortunate because in the first 40 years of my life, I had a very, very varied and interesting background. And for the last 40 years, I've been telling stories, a lot of them based on stories which come out of not my personal background, but backgrounds in which I can talk about because I've lived in those worlds. I tell stories about aviation, about the maritime, about ships in the sea, and of course other stories more common, of a general nature. But these are my special stories, and I was only thinking today, when you've told a story many times, and you know it's interesting, you can focus on the audience. You can put all your effort into connection and connecting and entertaining, bringing the audience in. You can do that if you are authentic and you know your stories backwards. My tip here is, if you've lived a certain stories with certain backgrounds Tell those stories. They're the most powerful, the second most powerful you can tell. The most powerful, of course, being that story, as I've said, the one that you were very, very reluctant to tell, but eventually got the courage to do so.